among us a very interesting topic to be delivered by Professor Johannes Urbaselem. I'm so sorry if I didn't pronounce his name correctly. Johannes is Prince Sultan bin Abdulaziz Professor of Energy, Resources and Environment at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He's also the founding director of the Initiative for Sustainable Energy Policy. He was formerly Assistant Professor of Political Science at Columbia University. He develops and tests sustainable solutions to the problem of lacking energy access in emerging economies. His research with ISEP, a groundbreaking research initiative on sustainable energy policy, offers pragmatic but effective approaches to providing the world's population with affordable, abundant energy at minimum environmental impact. I also welcome Shri Sanjeev Hansky, who is the Secretary, Energy Department, Government of Bihar. He has also held positions as Secretary, Water Resource Department, Government of Bihar. He is from IS 1997 batch. Unfortunately, Additional Chief Secretary, Industry Department, Brijesh Malhotra ji was also listed in the program, but he could not join us today because he is Bihar responsible for managing the oxygen supply in the state, so he is not present with us today. So, however, I think this would be a very interesting lecture as with COVID around, one of the biggest problems is the economic costs that we incur with repeated lockdowns and all other things. And one of the biggest challenges after, which would be a long-term challenge of managing this crisis, would be how to handle the economy and how to handle the negative effects that we had because of COVID. So in today's lecture, I think we would get some important insights into how to revive the industry, how to make Bihar's industry grow. And this is particularly important because I think that in general, the manufacturing sector in India, the share of manufacturing is really low. And Bihar is also, for Bihar, it's even lower than all of India. And unless we have a robust and growing manufacturing sector, it's very hard to have long-term economic growth. So I now welcome Johannes to deliver his lecture. Over to you, Johannes.
Excellent. Thank you, Ashmita ji. It's a great pleasure to be here presenting our research supported by the International Growth Center on firms and electricity use in the state of Bihar in India. I am grateful for everybody for joining our session today, despite the COVID-19 pandemic situation in India, and I do hope everybody is staying safe and avoiding any problems at this difficult time. Today we are going to look at some new research that we have just completed, a paper in the last month on this topic. And this research is based on data that we actually collected right before the COVID-19 setback. I remember very well being in Patna in January 2020, just a few months before the COVID-19 crisis, when we started the data collection. And of course, we had to stop the data collection because of the COVID-19 crisis, but fortunately we were able to collect enough data to draw at least some initial conclusions that may prove helpful for the state's policymaking. Now, Let me first just tell you a bit about our initiative. So the Initiative for Sustainable Energy Policy, or ISEP, was founded in October 2017 at my current institution, the School of Advanced International Studies. I'm the founding director, and we do a lot of work in the two largest economies of the world, China and India. In India, we've been looking at energy access, the use of energy for growth, the coal to renewables transition, power sector governance, and we have a particular interest in North India. And of course, we are delighted to work with the IGC and with ADRI and with the state government officials here today on evidence-based policymaking for Bihar. Now, the paper that we wrote is in collaboration with Setu Peltz, who's with the Rainer Lemoine Institute in Berlin, and with Mikael Aklin, who's at the University of Pittsburgh. The title of the paper is lengthy: Productive Electricity Use, Supply Quality, and Firm Preferences in Emerging Economies, Evidence from Micro and Small Enterprises in Bihar, India. And so here I want to highlight that our focus today is really going to be on micro and small enterprises. We are not going to be looking at medium-sized enterprises, so companies that have, let's say, 100 employees. We're really looking at the very small firms that typically have somewhere between 1 to 20 employees. And this is important for understanding the context, because the specific challenges that different types of firms face in using electricity are quite different. And today we'll be looking at the smallest ones. Now, the motivation for this research, of course, is that job creation remains possibly India's key challenge, right? So we know that underemployment is a very significant problem, and it's a problem from the perspective of considering what is India's primary advantage, and that is a young population, right? So India has a young population that could potentially deliver the same kinds of demographic dividends that, for example, China's young population did in the 80s and 90s. China had a kind of a baby boom in the 1960s, and then as a result of that, in the 80s and 90s, they had a very productive workforce. India could possibly deliver the same benefits, but that's not possible if we don't have job creation, and as a result, young people are underemployed. So this requires productive enterprises. And for state governments, of course, the state governments will need to play a key role here, right? Because a lot of this industrial policy and removing obstacles to investment is at the state level. Today we'll be looking specifically at the energy use issue, which is typically one of the 3 to 5 top priorities that firms mention in different enterprise surveys when we are looking at why they are facing difficulties growing, or what are the most important obstacles to increasing their profits and creating new jobs. So this is going to be what we do today. And now finally, to add to the slides, I do note that as Ashmita was saying, I think the COVID-19 situation adds an additional wrinkle here, because we know that the Indian economy was one of the worst hit economies anywhere in the world last year. And this year things had started to turn around, but now we are most likely going to face another decrease in economic growth. And as a result, there is an urgent need to first get the public health situation under control, and then after that to get the economies back on track to mitigate the long-term damage from the crisis. Now, let us look at a few numbers here before we get to the paper itself. First, I'll want to highlight what Ashmita was saying, is that industry as a share of GDP was already in India quite low before COVID-19. It was 23% in the country as a whole and 17% in Bihar. And this is a very low number, right? We all know that India is an unusual country in the sense that it was able to achieve high growth rates between 1991 and let's say around 2010, despite industrialization. This is one of the few countries in the world that have grown rapidly despite large-scale industrial expansion, right? So India is kind of the Indian economy has a very large agricultural basis, a small but growing industrial basis, and then a very significant service basic of an innovation economy out of centers like Hyderabad, Mumbai, and Bangalore. And in the next decade, we expect that India will need to create 10 crore or 100 million new jobs. That's a very massive undertaking for the country. And firms also recognize in India some of the key issues that come up in the enterprise surveys that the World Bank does include business registration, clearances, permits, regulations, infrastructure, credit, and skilled labor. And we here focus on the infrastructure part, particularly electricity. Now, if you want to sort of fully understand the kind of difference between India and China, I think this graph that I'm including here, which is industrial value added, including construction, is quite significant. So you see that despite fluctuation in both countries, there is a persistent 15 to 20 percentage point difference in the two countries. So the Chinese growth story looks a lot more like what other countries that have made the sort of move from lower income to higher middle income or even high income. In the case of, for example, Taiwan and South Korea, the industry has played a big role, and India is unusual in this sense. Now, what we did here is that we wanted to understand the micro and small enterprises in Bihar. And the sampling design was based on the idea that we randomly selected every other district. So out of India's 38 districts, Bihar's 38 districts, we picked 19 for our sampling. And the aim was to collect data from all 19 of them, which would have been a very nice design. Unfortunately, COVID-19 made this impossible. So we were literally in the field in March 2020. And then toward the end of the March, Bihar started reporting a breakout of COVID-19. I remember having discussions with Kumar and asking on what is the case situation, how is it spreading, and then because it started to look like there could be a possible health problem both to our team and to the respondents, we had to stop. But fortunately, we were able to collect data from 696 surveys in 10 districts. So again, it's not ideal, it's not what we wanted to do, but it's still quite reasonable to get an initial understanding of the issues that the Indian firms face in this case in Bihar. And the firms included in our sample are a quite diverse group, but there's a few key patterns that I want to highlight. So what we have here is we are showing the counts of different types of firms in our sample. So I want to highlight a few key points here. One is the dominance of kind of small scale service firms. So the most common type, for example, is a grocery seller. The second one is a retail shop selling clothes, right? So these are the kind of firms that when we think of micro and small, we should be thinking, right? So the issue here, of course, is that on this scale, there are fewer opportunities for kind of industrial activity. You cannot run a factory as a micro enterprise. That would be at least a kind of medium size firm. And as a result, you get a more service oriented sample in this approach. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody is just selling something. Not everything here is retail. We do have a number of companies that provide also more sort of processing. So for example, we have a few mills. We have two milk chilling centers here. We have two health clinics. And we have a number of sort of repair services. So we have tailoring, cycles, carpentry, and car or bike repair. So it's a diverse group of firms, but more focused on the service side. And again, this is very important for then understanding the electricity use. Now, let's get to the question of electricity use here. So on the left, I am showing the primary source of electricity for the firms. And there's a few key items to highlight here. One is that grid electricity access among these firms is only 59% in the sample. This is much lower than the household electricity access, which in Bihar is well north of 90%. The reason for this is shown then on the right hand side. We ask the firms, why don't you have electricity? The most common reasons: you cannot afford it, or you don't need it, or you can get it. So what we mean by not affording it is a combination of connection costs. These are not households, so they don't qualify for the Solbakia scheme with free or heavily subsidized connections, but also then the monthly electricity bills. Don't need, again, if we go back to the kinds of firms that we see here, not all of them really need electricity for their operations. So if you're, for example, a grocery seller, unless you're planning to sell something that requires chilling, it's not clear why you would need electricity. The only thing you might need is a light, right? Can't get. So some of these firms are based in locations and in buildings that cannot be electrified. They don't meet the building codes for electrification, and as a result, they cannot get electricity. So those are the three most common reasons why these firms do not have electricity. Now, here's what the firm profitability and electricity consumption looks like. So if we look at the monthly profits in rupees, we see that most firms do very little business. So the monthly profit is less than 10,000 rupees per month. And again, for our international audiences, we're talking about $150 in this case. So again, these are very small firms. They're mostly one, two, or two people trying to make a living. We do have a few firms that are significantly larger, that have over 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 rupees. Again, none of these firms are big. These are not large firms that pay, income tax or have a big payroll or anything. But we do have a few firms that are significantly more productive. The electricity consumption patterns are also quite interesting. So if we look at the daily electricity consumption in watt hours, just divide by 1,000 and you get the kilowatt hours or units, as we would say. Again, you see most firms don't consume any electricity, and the mass here is actually below 1,000 watt hours. So again, these firms in this mass would have, for example, an LED light and nothing else. There are some firms that consume more, but again, overall, the daily electricity consumption among the firms is very low in our sample. And this becomes important again for understanding the policy issues. Now, let's next look at what do these firms actually do with the electricity that they do have. And in this graph, we show separately the grid-connected firms, and then those that use either distributed energy or no electricity at all. And note that the y-axis here is the proportion of firms. So 100% of the relevant subsample. It's not the number of firms here. So the most common use by far, of course, is light. And that's quite understandable because any business can benefit from having a light. Not everybody has a light. If you only do, for example, business during the day, but all grid-connected firms have a light, and 54% of all other firms have a light. A phone is, of course, another common one. Here, there's a kind of an interesting question here. What does it mean for a firm to have a phone as opposed to a person to have a phone? These numbers are actually lower than individual phone ownership in Bihar today. But nonetheless, many of the firms say that they have a phone number that they use for dealing with customers, suppliers, and all that. Use of fans is also very common. Again, Bihar gets very hot in March to June, and as a result, people in these firms often have fans both to reduce their thermal stress, but also to make it more convenient for the customers. Now, where it gets tricky is that if we then look at the other more sort of directly productive enhancing uses, these are very rare in the sample. So IT is only used by 25% of grid connected and 4% of other firms. Fridges, 14 versus 0. That 0 is quite understandable, right? Because without the grid connection, it's very hard to run a fridge today. Mechanical energy, so any kind of like grinding or threshing or any kind of machine, it's very rare, 8% with grid connected, 1% with everybody else. And any kind of thermal energy, some kind of heating, for example, is only 23% of grid connected and 7% of others. So again, the striking pattern here is that most firms use energy like households do, lighting and air circulation and phone, and that's about it. So that's really important to understanding the the reality of energy use in this sector today. Now, the good news that we do find in the study is that our surveys confirm what many of us expected, is that Bihar has done an excellent job at improving the quality of electricity supply. So the hours available per day, the average is 19 hours as reported by the firms, which again is excellent. It's a remarkable improvement over just 10 years ago in Bihar, when this number would have been 10 or less. Days with blackouts, the mean is only 1. So typically, most days you don't get any kind of significant blackout, and days with voltage fluctuation is below 1. So again, the quality of electricity supply is good in Bihar today, and the firms do not seem to think that the quality itself is a major problem. Okay, let's now talk about sort of the recap the key results from the empirical research. So again, only 60% had electricity connection, 25% had off-grid electricity source, and 17% had no electricity at all. So we see here relatively low electricity access rates among the firms. Electricity consumption was very low, only 2.5 units for grid-connected firms and 0.6 units per day for firms without grid electricity. Only basic services were mostly used. Service was reliable enough, and generally speaking, firms did not have a strong preference for grid versus off-grid electricity. So firms were fine with whatever meets their needs. It's quite understandable. Electricity is electricity, and people just want to have some kind of electricity for their needs. Okay, let's now next turn to the policy implications here. So this is the key part of the study that I really want to highlight today. Number one, we believe that the state government should consider reducing connection costs for small firms and evaluate the benefits of lower electricity prices. So generally speaking, if we look at the Indian electricity access situation, we can say that almost all households now have electricity. The access rate is well above 90%. And among those that don't, the primary issue would be something like lack of affordability, or in some rare cases, difficult geography. But among the firms, this is not the case yet. We actually have reasonably low electricity access rates. So reducing the connection costs where that's viable from a cost perspective is something that could help firms gain access to more electricity. Now, if you look at the lower electricity prices, the story is slightly more complicated. On the one hand, it is true that the firms don't consume a lot of electricity, and as a result, electricity is not a huge kind of drain on their profitability. At the same time, when we ask the firms about their willingness to invest in different kinds of business expansions, we do see that lower electricity prices would contribute to capital investment. So about half of the firms say that they would be, for example, interested in buying new appliances or machinery if they had lower electricity prices. So therefore, our recommendation here would be to conduct some kind of a pilot study to see to what extent the gains exceed the costs. Because again, we have to remember that this kind of an intervention could go wrong in a number of ways. Number one is that you lower the electricity prices, but you don't get the investment. And in that case, that's yet another drain on the distribution companies of the state, which are already struggling with the financial burden. Even if you're able to encourage capital investment, it's not clear that the capital investment is productive, right? Because if the way you encourage the capital investment is a subsidy, then it is a kind of a distortion to the prices. And in fact, it might be that you should not be making those investments, and the subsidy makes you invest in inefficient capital stock. So again, here we see a possible need to study before moving forward. We're pretty confident about the connection costs. That seems to be something, 60% is a very low number for these small companies, But on the electricity cost front, we are less confident, and that's why we recommend further study. When it comes to ways of connecting firms, we do think that distributed power generation has some potential here, because we've seen in many cases that either the cost or the structure in which the firm is based are actually not suitable for grid electricity connection. And so therefore, to meet these basic needs for electrical energy, distributed energy has some potential. I remember myself that my first project in Bihar was actually an effort to promote solar lighting among the Patna street vendors. Now, that was a long time ago, 7-8 years ago. Prabhat G might remember our discussions back then on some of these issues in Patna. Today, Patna has mostly solved these problems. If you go to almost any market, there's some kind of battery charged or electric lighting available. But the same is not necessarily true in smaller towns of Bihar, which are often significant as markets and kind of hubs of economic exchange. So here we would suggest looking at distributed energy and continuing to expand it. And I would be very keen to hear what our distinguished colleagues from government of Bihar have to say about their plans for distributed energy. Finally, we do think that increasing electricity consumption is itself valuable, but in our view, the primary obstacles here are not actually on the electricity side. They're more on the other difficulties that small firms face in doing business. So if we look at the balance of evidence that we have overall, we see high quality supply, we see some concern about cost, but not excessive, and we see relatively low electricity connection rates. That all in combination to us tells us that there are other more significant challenges that these firms face. And two issues that come out from our survey that are possibly interesting and important here would include access to credit. So many of the firms cite this as a key problem that they face in doing business, is that they have difficulty accessing kind of working capital. When they want to buy something from their suppliers, when they have to pay their debts, it's just difficult for them. And as a result, they're not able to sell as much as they would like. The other one is consumer demand. So again, of course, in the end, for any business, the biggest problem is having enough consumer demand. And so as a result, I think there is some need to stimulate the demand among the consumers so that would contribute to job creation and then to electricity consumption increase. And this will become particularly important in the context of COVID-19, because there is this kind of unexpected but very serious macroeconomic shock, which means that the overall economy is kind of working at a low pace, and to get out of that hole, I think public finance is going to have to play an important role here. Okay, so let's now finally talk about next steps. Okay, so again, as I said, we see this project as a first step toward what we hope will become a kind of more long-term engagement in Bihar. So let us talk a little bit about some of the next steps that we are going to do in this project. So right now we are looking at the COVID-19 crisis and recovery among the small and medium Bihari enterprises. And here what we are doing is we are trying to understand how did they adapt to COVID-19? How did firms change their behavior and their business model when COVID-19 hit? What are their recovery prospects? To what extent do the small firms face difficulties because of COVID-19? And this is an interesting question. I want to sort of highlight here is it's actually not entirely obvious what the extent of difficulty here is. We know that, for example, COVID-19 was extremely difficult for those Indian households that had sent migrant workers to the cities, because the workers had to leave the cities, go back home to their villages, so they lost often their most important source of income. But for small firms, it's not entirely clear, right? It is probably true that some of them that are on the sort of like I wouldn't say luxury, but like not necessity side of things may face difficulty. So maybe the decrease in the need for photocopies, or maybe the beauty parlors will have a little less need because people are staying at home, there are fewer weddings, there's less things like this happening during COVID-19. But if you are selling groceries, people still need to eat, right? They need to get food somewhere. So as a result, it's not clear that there's a big decrease. In fact, here in the United States, completely different economy. But here, grocery shops actually increased their profits during COVID-19 because people didn't want to go to restaurants, right? So they instead bought more food from the grocery stores and often had delivery, and delivery adds some extra cost. Again, India, completely different economy, but you could imagine that some of these firms are actually not struggling. And the way to do this, we plan to do telephone surveys. So again, in a context like this, it would be highly irresponsible to send field teams because they would contribute to the spread of the disease, and then the workers would also be at risk. So what we do instead is we do telephone surveys. We are developing them now, and we are trying to pilot them. And we are hoping to reach some subsample of these firms here. And again, here I need to acknowledge, of course, the International Growth Center for making this basic study possible. And I also want to highlight Energy for Growth and Chevron Corporation for providing support for the telephone follow-up. So thank you for our.
Thanks, Johannes, for this excellent talk. And as you can see that there are many, many questions, and the chat box and the question answer both is active. But before that, I would like to first invite Sri Sanjeev Hans, who is the Secretary in the Energy Department.
Yeah, thanks, Ashmita. And very good afternoon to all of you. The eminent analysts and the fellow participants in this. I'm actually not keeping that well, so I'll keep my remarks very brief. First of all, I would like to appreciate what Mr. Johannes has brought out in his presentation, even though it's a small random survey that has been done. The findings are quite relevant and quite near to reality of the Bihar scenario. I wouldn't like to comment on the industry policy side of the findings, but I'll restrict myself to the energy part, the electricity part. See, what this small random survey has also brought out, typically there are micro enterprises spread all across the state, and you cannot distinguish between an industrial area and a residential area. It is a mixed kind of population, and the kind of challenge which we see as a service provider is that we have to supply the electricity to the consumers through mixed feeders. So we have domestic, we have industrial load tagged to it, we have non-domestic load tagged to it, and we have these micro enterprises also running in the houses. Connections are domestic, and then they are running the commercial enterprises. Though their power requirement is not much, it's very minimal, but the kind of power quality and the reliability which a typical micro enterprise needs is definite. In this section, the outcome of this survey, not many people, not many industries have complained about the reliability or voltage fluctuation. So that means power supply is there. The other aspect is around, if I'm recollecting it, don't need is 35% and can't afford is 53%. So if we take these two categories, one policy change which our distribution companies, we have both the distribution companies, one in North, one for South Bihar. So we have taken a policy initiative that up to 59 kilowatts of load, the cost of infra will not be passed on to the consumers. So this is going to be a great boon to the micro enterprises. So this is one intervention which we have already planned, undertaken. Number two, people were afraid of lots of procedures and manual interventions. So this has all been brought online since last year, January 2020. Part of it was already online, but complete transformation has happened in January 2020. So now people can actually get the connections with fewer documents sitting at their home. So this is one intervention which we have already done. Number two, the cost of infra up to 59 kilowatt of load, that will be borne by the discoms only. So you'll see around 99% of the industries which you are targeting, they fall under this load category. So they will not have to bear any kind of cost related to infrastructure. But what is needed is the stimulation of the consumers, the demand stimulation. Excuse me. So demand stimulation can happen both if the industry department takes a lead, provides some easier credit, and from our side also, we can start massive campaigns telling them the use of grid connected electricity, the benefits, rather than going in for standalone off-grid generating mechanisms. So this we can actually promote. Another point which has been brought out is also good for distributive power generation systems. But then again, it will have to necessarily involve everyone. See, we'll have a mix of all kinds of load, domestic, industry. So it will become a little difficult. Better would be one suggestion that if we can have common utility areas, maybe at block level, if not at village level, some common utility areas, which the industry department, of course, can start. And then there we can have dedicated feeders, dedicated power supply. So these are a few inputs from our side. Also, from our side, we are providing around 23 paisa or 25 paisa per unit subsidy to the LTI's consumers. So these are the inputs from my side. Thank you.
Of course, Mr. Hans, thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate your insights. It does sound to me like the industry department is very much on top of these challenges, and so I have full confidence that Bihar will come out of this swinging. So let me start with those 3 questions in Q&A, and then I think many more in the chat box. So let me start with the questions on Q&A. First of all, we have Harsha Krishna is asking about the use of electricity and noting that given that a lot of the load is mostly used for lights and fans, wouldn't this mean a case for decentralized grids and solar? And yes, I think what we've discussed here today, there is value for decentralized. I do think the point that Mr. Hans made is also very important here, though we need to think about what is the sort of right mix and use of electricity in different contexts. If you already have a full service grid electricity system, then adding decentralized doesn't necessarily do more than duplicate the capital need. So I think you need to have kind of an integrated planning approach. What are the demands and so on. Ranjit Kumar is asking if we use the new definition of micro and small enterprise. So we were unfortunately not able to do our sampling based on the definition. We identified the firms based on marketplaces in different towns and villages. And then we went around looking for businesses that are of small size. So we did not use a definition-based sampling here. Ranjit Kumar is asking if this study has taken into account enterprises rural as urban. Yes, and this is actually one of the nice things about this study is that we have data both for villages and for towns. And so as a result, we can also do comparative analysis. I would request the colleagues in Bihar give us some thought if this is something that would be helpful for policymaking, comparing village and town electricity use and firm behavior. And Sandeep Mitra is asking if we use the service sector. So in this case, yes, in fact, most of our firms are formally service sector because a lot of the industry is on a larger scale and our sampling design was not suitable for large firms because like Mr. Hans was saying, they tend to be in like dedicated industrial areas. And for that, you would need a different kind of sampling strategy than what we have. It's a very interesting question. And I think something that we should also study, because if you think of ideally how the economy would work is that you would have these large firms that are productive. They're selling goods to Delhi, they're selling goods to Mumbai, they're selling goods to Amsterdam, right? And then they would contract, they would have smaller subcontractors that would create a huge number of jobs for the Indian people. So that would be the sort of ideal chain. So that's why it's important to understand both the large firms and their behavior and the small firms and their behavior. Okay, let's switch now to the chat. We have lots of commentary and questions here as well. So let me start from the beginning. Okay, so of course there's some useful links here for people who want to study some of the discussions. Then we have Abhishek Tripathi is asking if you're going to share a link to the paper. We have submitted the paper to the IGC, and I assume Kumar and team will provide the information on that when that becomes appropriate. Okay. So Sandeep Mitra is asking about if you are excluding micro enterprises with unregistered and unorganized. In fact, most of our firms are unorganized. So this typical firm would be one person firm that doesn't have any kind of formal infrastructure. And in fact, this is again important because the large organized firms are the ones that create the economic growth with exports and all that. But the smaller firms are where the jobs are. So both sectors are actually quite important for the overall health of the Indian economy and people's well-being. Okay. And yes, I see now that we can, yes, so Kumar, we can certainly email the draft to Sandeep, no problem at all. And I see Abhishek Tripathi is also asking, and lots of people are now sending their emails. Okay, good. All right. Azhar Hussain is asking about electricity consumption in surveys by asking the owner or looking at the past bills. This is a very good question. In our case, we had to do the survey-based research because, first of all, about 1/3 of the firms don't have an electricity connection, so we cannot in any way estimate based on the bill. And second of all, even the firms that do have electricity connection, like we heard from Mr. Hans, it's often the same connection that they have for the household. And as a result, we cannot distinguish between the firm electricity and the household electricity. We have other work ongoing in Jharkhand right now, where we look at households, and we were able to collect about 50% of the sample actual bills. They're very challenging to read because Jharkhand, like many other states, use sometimes estimated electricity. So if the meter doesn't work, they put the average cost on you. And as a result, you have to be very careful with interpreting the numbers. But we are pretty confident that what you can do today is you can use the available bills to get a kind of an understanding of electricity connection. And then you can use surveys to extrapolate that consumption to firms, to individuals and households that do not have bills. But this is very difficult to do with firms, unfortunately. Okay, let's keep going. Okay, Thomas Timberg is asking if 90% of households have electricity connection, is it possible that these firms, many household industries, are getting electricity through a household account? Absolutely. In fact, if we look at most of the electricity connections, like Mr. Hans was saying, these are all technically domestic connections, right? These are typically in rural areas they are not in industrial zones with high voltage connections. So in many cases, but in our case, the question we ask in the survey is if you have electricity at use in your firm. So if it's in the household account, it's still included in our sample. So the ones that say we don't have electricity, these are firms that are not at the household that would have electricity at home in most cases. Okay. We keep going here. Lots of questions. So here we have we do see that Setu Peltz, my co-author, who is in the audience, is responding also to Azar on the use of estimating electricity. Okay, next we have. Saira Gune is asking about how would these firms go about increasing the productivity once they have access to electricity. I think the main thing here is twofold. Number one is for existing firms is just looking for more productive ways of using appliances. So for example, if you're a grocery store, what can you sell if you have a fridge, cold storage that you couldn't sell before, right? That's one strategy. You can probably sell quite a few high value products, everything from cold drinks to fish to some of the more perishable fruit, for example, you would be able to sell. On the other hand, if you are a firm that's thinking of expansion, so let's say that you have currently you have a firm that is distributing milk. Again, you could add a chilling center, or you could even add a kind of a purification center to make it higher grade so that you can sell it at a higher cost to, for example, the larger supply chains. The third possibility is new firms, right? A lot of the growth from better electricity could also be just new firms coming into town that require electricity. These kind of IT-based service companies, like for example, the cyber shops, these would require electricity by definition. If it's cheaper, then that's more profitable. So that's another area. Here, Pooja is asking about difference in micro and small enterprise in electricity consumption. Setu, if you're still in the audience, I can't quite remember what the correlation between firm size and electricity consumption is. If you have that number or some statistic, please share in the chat. I don't want to run regressions while I'm talking to the audience. That's a little too much multitasking. Okay. Now we have Ranjit Kumar is noting that they did a PhD on informal food processing industry in Bihar and found that electricity use increases the probability of firms' growth. Okay. And yes, we would certainly agree with that if you have access to good electricity and if you know how to use it, it creates opportunities for growth. And food processing is certainly one of those industries where there's real opportunity, more so than in some of the others. If you're just selling, for example, utensils, right, then it's not clear why electricity would do anything to help you, right? But if you are in food processing, there are many uses, appliances, cold storage, different processing appliances that you can use. Okay. Sandeep is asking about the sampling procedure. So what we did was we first sampled the districts, a random sample based on population. Then within the districts, we used the census records to create a list of both towns and villages. We then weighted those lists so that we get a right sample of urban as opposed to rural locations. And then we sampled again based on population. And then there within each town or village, we looked at the nearest marketplace and then sampled there based on kind of finding a landmark and then picking a random direction and choosing, every other firm or so on. This was very difficult to do, by the way. I just want to highlight this, that when I was in Patna, in January 2020, it really became clear to me, and Setu did this earlier also, that this is a very difficult thing to do, the sampling of these firms, because just identifying them is difficult. Okay, what proportion are household firms? Again, Setu, if you are in the audience, I am asking if there is any possibility there. Okay. And yes, confounding efforts come in household enterprises, domestic. Yes, this is very important to note. But again, given that we ask this is survey based, where we ask people how they use appliances in the business, that's why we think we are able to do this. And then adaptive sampling, Adaptive sampling, I think, is in many ways quite good, but here we wanted to get as close as representative as possible. Again, it's not perfect because this is really hard to do. We don't have like formal lists of firms or anything that we could use, but we wanted to get as close to doing a representative sample. And of course, the biggest problem and regret here is that we did not get the COVID-19 situation. We missed this literally by 2 weeks. If we had 2 weeks more, we would have been able to do the rest. We were just doing lots of surveys, like 50 surveys a day. But then because of COVID-19, we obviously had to stop. I think we are now have a few more questions in Q&A. Let me see if I'm able to go here. There's the question of invisible trade by Sandeep Mitra. Again, yes, this is correct. But I do think once you get to the point where people are doing bartering or giving to their families or something, at that point, I think the job creation opportunity is gone. So that's why we don't think that's so significant here. Rice mills, so technically we did include them, but we didn't encounter many of them. Again, most likely reason I think is that rice mills typically a bit bigger, so and they would be in a kind of a specific hub close to agriculture. So we didn't have many rice mills, but I think we had 2 in the sample, but technically we did include them in the study. I think that just about answers it for now. Am I missing anything? We went fast.
Yeah, so I just missed what your answer on this. Like somebody asked, how did you measure the electricity access? Was it the number of lights and fans that they use, or their electricity bills?
Yes, so there is a very good answer to this in the chat from my colleague and co-author, and really the lead author of this study. Setu deserves all the credit here. That the way we did it is we have from the energy access literature and engineering literature, we have the study of kind of how much electricity would a light bulb use for an hour. So we ask people like which kinds of appliances you use, how much do you use them, and from that we construct the estimates. We did not use bills, again, because many firms did not have bills, and even the ones that did had a combined bill for household and enterprise. So it's not possible to distinguish the business side of electricity consumption in that case.
The point that I had in mind is that in Bihar, it's very common in some cases to just like directly get the connection without having an official meter. So, so I was wondering that out of the some of them do not have any official accounts and are just using it. So how do they get in your sample as those who have electricity? Yes. Or okay.
Yes, they would. So in this case, they would be in that one. I do see another question from Sandeep here, if we have looked at the annual survey of industries. Yes, but the annual survey of industries is for larger firms. We have used it in other studies, for example, estimating energy efficiency in the Indian industry, but we can't use it for the smaller firms because these informal firms between often 1 to 5 people would not show in fact, they wouldn't show in any surveys at the country scale. The closest would be the economic census, which does keep track of all the non-farm jobs, but even there, how to turn that into firms would be challenging.
So there is also this paper by Alcott and others who do look at the ASI for large firms, and they do find that there's an increase in productivity, right?
Correct. And I do think if you look at larger firms, electricity reliability becomes a bigger issue for a number of reasons. One of them is that Bihar today is one of the better states when it comes to reliability, right? It went from being the worst about 15 years ago to among the better ones, certainly in North India. If you look at Bihar versus Jharkhand, it's a massive difference. So in Jharkhand, for example, where we also do a lot of work, it's very common for a steel company to have their own power plant, right? They have an entire ecosystem built on their own because if you do steel, you need a good connection, right? And so that's why I think for the large firms, or the same thing, if you think of like an IT firm in Hyderabad, you can't just do it if you don't have reliable electricity. So that's why I think for the larger firms, it's even more important, the reliability.
So I really thank Johannes for coming today, this early hour. We could see the sun rise behind you while you were giving your talk. Now I would request Professor Ghosh to give a vote of thanks. So Professor Ghosh, over to you now.
Thank you very much. You see, I tell you that when was this study done?
This would have been done in February, March 2020.
2020,
so 1 year ago, right before COVID-19.
I see. I was thinking that whether it was in the early period after the Bihar has improved the electricity situation. Now, the situation in the power is even better. And the state government has also given a certain amount of benefits to the industries, as Sanjeev Hans was saying, you know. I presume a few other studies that I have seen, you know, the use of energy in industries in Bihar is now much more than what it used to be a couple of years earlier. Much more than what it used to be a couple of years earlier. And many people used to use what they call diesel as a source of power, you know, their own source of power. So the results that we have got, I think, is a positive results. And I'm sure these results are now become even more useful to the Bihar economy. And you haven't seen the ASI data because these are small industries. If you see the ASI data, you can see that in last about 5 to 6 years, you know, although the size of the ASI sector in Bihar is very small, the growth rate is much higher than in all India. Growth rate is much higher than in all India, which is a very positive aspect of the Bihar economy in general and the industry sector in particular. I'm sure some other studies will also come up highlighting this structural change in Bihar economy as far as use of energy is concerned. That's the point I wanted to make. And I thank you as well as all the participants for this such interesting discussions on Bihar economy. Thank you.